It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and welcome to it. We have a lot to talk about. Vanity Fair unleashed a ton of Star Wars-related news, specifically about the future of Star Wars. It's going to be televised for now. We do have some movie news, and I anticipate that we're going to be getting a lot of movie news coming up next week at Star Wars Celebration ahead of the Obi-Wan Kenobi premiere. So, we're going to break it all down in this week's show. Plus, it is a very special day. It is the release of the final, for now, book in my EMBARK science fiction space opera series, Battle Planet. Book 7 is available right now in ebook, paperback, and hardcover. I'll give you more details on that, but I really hope you'll support the show and go out and pick up your preferred copy of EMBARK Battle Planet Book 7. The series finale, again, for now. More details a little bit later on, but now let's get into this week's show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
It is My Nerd World, a Star Wars show. I am your host, Jon Justice, and I'm glad you are here for another episode. And we have got a lot to discuss. As I mentioned at the open of the show, today is release day for EMBARK Battle Planet Book 7 in my science fiction space opera series. Really proud of this book, as I am for all of my books, but really happy with the way that this story wraps up, completing the story arc that started in Book 5, The Rocket Queen, but also concludes the entire series that started in Book 1. For the future of the series, I don't know yet, and again, I'll get into that after we share a little bit of listener feedback this week. However, ahead of Star Wars Celebration next week, and I have my reasons as to why I think they did this. Vanity Fair has been dropping, and did drop, just a lot of information and interviews done with those behind the scenes and the actors and the content creators and Kathleen Kennedy of Star Wars, talking about the future of Star Wars. The entire piece was titled, "The Rebellion Will Be Televised." And I had some really mixed feelings when the news started to drop. But now that I've had some time to run through what the article had to say, look through contextually what the content creators like Jon Favreau, Dave Filoni, Kathleen Kennedy, to name a few, are saying about what they want to do with the future of Star Wars, I'm a little less trepidatious than I was, basically given my instinctive reaction that I want more theatrical Star Wars and less televised. They have a plan in place, and I do like the plan, and it will involve movies. To what extent, I think, remains to be seen, and my expectation is that they're holding some of that back for Star Wars Celebration next week. This Vanity Fair, this release of information from Vanity Fair, I think is, and has been put out there in order to not have to spend an abundance of time for the hardcore fans at Star Wars Celebration getting into the detailed specifics. I think at Star Wars Celebration, they want to make announcements, they want to show footage, they want to do interviews with the actors, with the creators, and this Vanity Fair information really does serve as a supplement for what we're going to get next week. So what we're going to do on the show is I'm going to break down the big points, the big takeaways from the Vanity Fair piece. And then I'm going to run through in detail the smaller pieces and the more detailed, a deeper dive into what Vanity Fair said about the future of Star Wars. So, depending on what level you want to get into, the beginning part of this podcast is going to tell you the broad strokes and the most important things you need to know before we do a deeper dive and get into listener feedback. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So again, the future of Star Wars will be televised for now. here are the big takeaways from Vanity Fair this week. Andor is premiering late summer this year. There's a lot more to say about everything that I'm about to share with you, by the way. Season 3 of The Mandalorian will return in late 2022 or early 2023, while Ahsoka is scheduled to premiere next year in 2023. The new show, codenamed Grammar Rodeo, that we've talked about here on this podcast, takes place post Return of the Jedi, which is different than what the leakers were saying. The plot remains a secret. It is created by the executive producer and director, Jon Watts, writer Chris Ford, who made Spider-Man Homecoming for Marvel. A casting notice has called for 4 children around ages 11 to 12 years old. Inside Lucasfilm, the show is being described as a galactic version of the classic Amblin coming-of-age adventure films of the 1980s. And again, like I said, I'll have more commentary about everything that I'm laying out right here. The Acolyte, according to its director, takes place roughly 100 years before The Phantom Menace. This is also expected to debut sometime in 2023. A lot of those characters haven't even been born yet in The Phantom Menace. We're taking a look at the political and personal and spiritual things that came up in a time period that we don't know much about. My question, said the director and writer, when watching The Phantom Menace was like, well, how did things get to this point? How did we get to the point where a Sith Lord can infiltrate the Senate and none of the Jedi pick up on it? Like, what went wrong? What are the scenarios that led us to this moment? And we also know from previous interviews that the Acolyte is supposed to come on the tail end of what we have been seeing in the High Republic novels. And again, more on this coming up a little bit later on in the show. A movie from Taika Waititi and 1917 screenwriter Christy Wilson Cairns will likely arrive first in theaters, with Rogue One from Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins happening a little bit further off. One thing to note about everything that was discussed in this Vanity Fair article is that given the time frame that especially Kathleen Kennedy makes in, we'll be getting this information coming up in the next few months. The understanding is that this interview was actually done a while ago, probably done sometime back in March, if not before that. They had Annie Leibovitz, who has photographed almost all of the major releases. These Vanity Fair pieces used to come out before every single film, starting with the prequels. I actually have several of the old prequel Vanity Fair cover stories from back when the prequels were being released. So now, because we're doing the televised live-action thing, they're now continuing the tradition of a Vanity Fair expose profile with Annie Leibovitz taking pictures. And the photographs that she shot for all of these upcoming shows, specifically The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, were just spectacular. If you have a chance to go online and check them out, I absolutely encourage you to do so. So a lot of the information we're getting here, we've actually gotten newer information that may change when we get into Celebration next week, as we may find out further details about what we're talking about on the show this week. It is true that Marvel president, as we talked about on last week's show, Kevin Feige, will produce a Star Wars film. Kathleen Kennedy says, I would love to see what movie he might come up with, but right now there isn't anything specifically. Now, the information that we had last week is that Kevin Feige was working on with Waldron, who wrote Loki, a script right now, and they were hard at work on it. So I think there's a very, very good possibility that we could get some Kevin Feige information about the show that they are working on as well. There's interesting connective tissue, though, with these films, because I do believe they're going to be standalone in that we're going to be introduced to new characters, but I'm also very much of the opinion that there's going to be connective tissue for a very specific reason to existing timelines. And again, I'm kind of giving you a preview of what we're going to get into in further detail coming up in a moment. In terms of Rian Johnson's trilogy, now this is really interesting because when the interview first came out with regard to Rian Johnson's trilogy, Kathleen Kennedy's quote that they first gave us was, that Rian Johnson's trilogy that was announced in 2017, even prior to the release of The Last Jedi, had been put on the back burner. Rian has been unbelievably busy with Knives Out and the deal that he made with Netflix for multiple movies. Many fans were saying, especially those that didn't like The Last Jedi, that this meant that the Rian Johnson trilogy was dead. Okay. When we get further into the podcast, what you're going to find out is that that could not be further from the truth. Now, we may be many years off, 5-6 years off, from a Rian Johnson trilogy. But Kathleen Kennedy specifically makes mention of Rian Johnson and his involvement with Lucasfilm that would certainly speak to the fact that eventually we are going to get more Rian Johnson Star Wars stories. So, with that being said, that's the broad strokes of what the Vanity Fair piece said. Now we're going to get into the article itself, and I tried to pull the best highlights from the article, the things that I thought were most interesting to go and share with you. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it.
This is not going to go the way you think.
The article starts off with a focus on Andor, speaking specifically about Diego Luna, saying that he had played the dauntless rebel spy Cassian Andor in Rogue One. Now, talking on the phone while driving in the car, he was with Tony Gilroy, who had punched up the movie's script for reshoots. Gilroy, whose credits include writing the first 4 Bourne thrillers and writing in director Michael Clayton, was developing a series that would explore Andor's backstory, revealing what drew him into the Galactic Rebellion and how he evolved from a self-serving nihilist into a selfless martyr. Luna's call with Gilroy, the first time he heard the full plan for the Andor story, happened more than 3 years ago. One thing I remember from being a part of this since day one is how little you can share of what happens, says Diego Luna. I have kids, man. It's painful for them. It's painful for me. Now, what's interesting about Tony Gilroy is that he was rather famously now, as the story goes, brought in to not only sort of punch up Rogue One, but a lot of people say now that he essentially kind of reworked that film completely. And you don't hear anything about Gareth Edwards anymore. I think Gareth Edwards deserves still a majority of the credit for what we saw on screen for Rogue One, but there's a lot of evidence out there that if it wasn't for Tony Gilroy, we certainly would not have gotten the film that so many people, including myself, have come to love. It's also interesting that Tony Gilroy was not a Star Wars fan when he got involved in this. He approached this from strictly a storytelling standpoint. And I think that's good for some directors, and I think that's bad for some directors when it comes to telling Star Wars stories. I think for the sake of Andor and what we're going to get from that series, and certainly what we got from Rogue One, it was a benefit to the story that Tony Gilroy was not a fan. George Lucas himself had adapted and abandoned a live-action Star Wars series called Underworld before he sold Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company in 2012. Scripts were written and test footage shot, but the level of quality he was looking for proved to be too expensive for a TV budget. Then in 2017, Lucasfilm was tasked with trying again, this time making not one series, but a whole fleet to bolster its parent company's streaming ambitions, Disney+. They would need the firepower of many Star Wars shows to compete against the rival titans like Netflix and Amazon. The Mandalorian, we know now, became a global phenomenon, which only raised expectations. Now, with 130 million subscribers waiting, Disney has upped its demands to 3 separate Star Wars shows within a year. For this story, Lucasfilm has lifted the secrecy surrounding its TV universe and how it formed as universes do under immense pressure. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of the nuances of Disney Plus and what they share in the article here. I want to add something, though. I am a little bit worried, and we went into this in great detail after the weekly radio show that I do here on Twin Cities News Talk in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was tempted to we do what we call a post-show podcast. We upload the full show for everybody to download, the full 3 hours. And then on occasion, after the show is done, we record just a podcast where myself, my co-host, Drew Lee, and the current producer that we have, Brett, just kind of talk. And we got into a really deep discussion over a lot of what was revealed in this Vanity Fair article. If you're interested in hearing it, because we do talk about other things, including the Marvel Cinematic Universe, go wherever you listen to podcasts. Just type in Justice and Drew, and you'll find today's post-show podcast, and you can listen to that discussion. There's probably about a good 30 to 40 minutes of us talking about Star Wars, and I was tempted to go and grab that audio and throw it on the podcast this week, but because I know I'm going to be spending a lot of time on my own with the material, I figured I would just point you in that direction if you wanted to go and listen to that for yourself. That being said, I'll make a comment that I made on the post-show podcast talking about this Vanity Fair piece here to you, and that is, I don't like the fact that Disney Plus has basically mandated Star Wars and also the MCU, Marvel, to give them 3 series a year. I don't find that particularly a good way to go and create content. Now, what's interesting is that in the piece, and I'll give you a bit of a preview of what's coming up, Kathleen Kennedy says that one of the struggles that they've had when it comes to creating Star Wars content, and we've seen this with the directors that have come and gone, is that Lucasfilm is really demanding that if a director comes on to do Star Wars material, they're going to have to devote 4 to 5 years of their lives to the project. They can't just hire somebody for a one-off and then have them move on. So that gives me a little bit more confidence of what they want to do for the future of Star Wars, because I don't necessarily like the idea of mandating this many shows being told within a particular timeline or, IP, intellectual property. Personally, I think that Marvel is suffering because of this. I was not a big fan of Moon Knight by any stretch. The trailer for Miss Marvel and for She-Hulk, Attorney at Law have done nothing for me, and right now I have no desire to watch those shows. I don't want the same thing to happen to my beloved Star Wars. I have no control over that, but there are things that I'll share with you that give me a little bit more confidence that that's not going to happen, and the shows that they will be producing will live up to the expectations that we Star Wars fans have. So, getting back to Andor. On the day when Luna was recruited for Andor back in 2019, the actor remembers looking out the car window at the rooftops of the adjacent buildings, visualizing the tale about a resistance-minded spy and near-death escapes. He was especially glad that Gilroy's proposal included details that resonated personally. Luna describes Andor as a refugee story with desperate people fleeing the Empire at the full force of its power. It's the journey of a migrant, he says. That feeling of having to move is behind this story very profoundly and very strong. That shapes you as a person. It defines you in many ways and what you're willing to do. The story begins with the destruction of Andor's birth world, and then follows him into adulthood when he realizes he can't run forever. Which, of course, just brings about the Death Star and the expectations of what we could see, right? His adopted home will become the base of our whole first season, and we watch that place become radicalized, Gilroy says. Then we see another planet that's completely taken apart in a colonial kind of way. The Empire is expanding rapidly. They're wiping out anybody who's in their way. By Journey's End, Andor's path will be to block theirs. I said it before, I'm going to say it again. Andor really looks like it could be something special. Something on par with storytelling along the lines of, say, Dune or Game of Thrones. Not in terms of story beats, but in terms of the sweeping arc of the storytelling, right? And again, Gilroy essentially retooled Rogue One into the movie that we all know. The show also focused on the enigmatic rebel leader Mon Mothma, played by Genevieve O'Reilly, who portrayed her as a young senator in Revenge of the Sith in a deleted scene and then reprised the role again in Rogue One. Her story will run parallel to the title character, whom we know will eventually become one of her key agents. It is a huge orchestral Dickinsonian ensemble cast, says Gilroy. It's the theme that binds all the new shows, devotion. What's unique about Star Wars is that we're one story, basically, says Lucasfilm President Kathleen Kennedy. George was always dealing with episodes. Ironically, he was serializing his storytelling. He was influenced by Flash Gordon and cliffhangers on Saturdays at movie theaters. All of that informed what the DNA of Star Wars is, which is why I think it's just organic that we made the transition into television. Now, the transition was not an obvious pivot for an empire built on movies. When she took over Lucasfilm in 2012, Kennedy's primary goal was to rejuvenate Star Wars with a new era of films after a trilogy of prequels that underwhelmed many fans. All of this led to the hiatus, a fallow spot in the Star Wars film landscape that Kennedy announced early in 2019, months before The Rise of Skywalker even debuted. Factor in the standalone movies Rogue One and Solo, and the Bay Area production company had been churning out a blockbuster a year at a breakneck pace, considering that Lucas himself only released one Star Wars film every 3 years. The most important lesson they'd learned was this: Star Wars requires a greater degree of professional devotion from filmmakers. Anyone who comes into the Star Wars universe needs to know that it's a 3 to 4 to 5 year commitment. That's what it takes. You can't step in for a year, then shoot something, then walk away. It requires that kind of nurturing. Now, she'll talk a little bit more about this. I want to pause for a second because a lot of everything that we're reading hinges upon and is because of what happened with Solo. Kathleen Kennedy makes some comments about Solo a little bit later on that I'll extrapolate further. I think the biggest problem that Solo had wasn't that it was too close to The Last Jedi. It was because there wasn't enough connective tissue to the storytelling that we all know. People go and see all the Marvel cinematic films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, partly because they want to see those characters, but more because they don't want to miss a part of the story. It's been an ongoing saga. Culminates at the end of phases with one big ensemble film, right, with all of the characters that we were introduced to. But people are going out and seeing Ant-Man and Captain Marvel, right? They're going and seeing these particular characters partly because of who they are, but mostly because they don't want to miss out on the storytelling taking place. Solo didn't have that, in my opinion. I love Solo, don't misunderstand. I love Solo. I think it's a fantastic, fun film. But you can miss Solo and not miss anything. And I think fans knew that. Let me rephrase. Casual fans knew that. And that's what requires a massive blockbuster to go and be just that, a massive blockbuster. It requires not just hardcore fans and not just fans, but really just casual fans to get up out of their seats and go see it again. The hardcore fans will go and see those Star Wars films over and over again. But if you don't have those casual fans turning out in droves, right, if they feel like they can miss it, then you're not going to do well. And that's why the big reason why Solo didn't do well. I thought Alden Ehrenreich was fantastic. I thought that Donald Glover was fantastic. But the casual fan was like, Solo backstory that doesn't have Harrison Ford with this guy that doesn't look like Harrison Ford playing Harrison Ford? I think I can skip it. And a lot of people did. Getting back into the article and talking about the future of Star Wars, Kathleen Kennedy said, I knew that Jon Favreau was always deeply interested in Star Wars, talking about bringing on content creators that can make a commitment. He was the first person I went to. He said, not only would I have an interest, I have an idea. He was willing to meet that new criteria of hers. What's unique about Jon is his commitment, Kennedy says. He had the sole focus pretty much on this for the last several years, and that's been a godsend. After meeting at Kennedy's office in Santa Monica, Favreau started to work without a contract. But there was a problem. The problem Kennedy faced was that another esteemed creative executive, Dave Filoni, had also devised a series focused on the Mandalorians, while Jon Favreau had also pitched an idea for The Mandalorian. Filoni wanted to explore some of the ideas they'd never fully realized. He said, I remember when I did Clone Wars, George came in and said, well, the Mandalorians are pacifists in this time period. And I'm like, oh, well, that's very different than what everybody thinks they are. And he was like, well, you've got to remember that people are never just one thing. Cultures evolve. They change over time. After meeting in Los Angeles, Favreau and Filoni exchanged ideas and drawings for The Mandalorian that would combine their ideas. Favreau's idea for the child was the biggest sticking point. It gave us some pause, Kennedy says, talking about Grogu. He and Dave debated that quite ferociously. Honestly, it's something that I never would have done because Yoda is Yoda, Filoni says. Yoda's homeworld and backstory were never fully realized. He wanted to protect the mystery that Lucas built around that original Jedi Master. I think people look back now and think it was like a slam dunk, but we were very cautious, Filoni says of the child. The amount of measuring, especially in the first season, for how we were framing this kid took a lot of effort. Then they spend a lot of time talking about the volume. The colossal curved LED can envelop a film as effectively as any location shoot, generating an environment that convincingly is photorealistic even to a digital camera. And what they dive into is the effect that this had on The Mandalorian, the quality of the show that we see, and also one of the big reasons, or a reason why they were able to go and bring Ewan McGregor, even though he wanted to return to Star Wars. But another reason why he was so encouraged to come back, because he would be working with less green screen and more actual sets that looked like sets. Star Wars actors tend to become Star Wars actors for life, the article goes on to say. In the late 90s, this led McGregor to agonize over playing the young Obi-Wan Kenobi in the prequel movies. And he was relieved to put the franchise behind him when it was over. But in 2017, McGregor was invited to the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood for a marathon screening of every Star Wars film. They asked me if I wanted to introduce one. I've never done anything like that, but suddenly it just struck me that I really wanted to, McGregor recalls. Why had his feelings changed? I don't know, he says. I really do think it has to do with growing up. He enjoyed seeing people in sleeping bags pulling all-nighters with his movies. Kids who had grown up with the prequels weren't as cynical as the critics. A few reviewers had even begun to reappraise them. People loved him as Obi-Wan, which made McGregor realize that he did too. Now, Lucasfilm intended to make Obi-Wan Kenobi as a movie to be directed by the Oscar nominee Stephen Daldry. When the Obi-Wan film later evolved into the Obi-Wan TV series as part of Lucasfilm's new yearning for Disney Plus content, Daldry departed, and Deborah Chow, a director from The Mandalorian, came on board with the goal to keep the series cinematic in scope. There remained one missing component, McGregor's prequel co-star Hayden Christensen. In the fall of 2019, Chow sat at Christensen's living room, we talked about this on a previous episode, asking him to return as the fearsome tyrant in the galaxy. At the time of the meeting, it had been 14 years since Revenge of the Sith, and the actor assumed that the galactic glory days were done. He was happy to be wrong. Now, technically, you don't need Christensen for Vader. All you need is the mask, the hulking figure in the suit. And if you're lucky, James Earl Jones's imperious voice. But now, of course, you have the technology where they can replicate that. Although, while we still have a James Earl Jones, I hope that they still use him. But you do need Christensen to show the audience the hot-headed but compassionate man who was lost when Anakin Skywalker became Vader. A lot of my conversations with Deborah were about wanting to convey this feeling of strength, but also coupled with imprisonment, Christensen says. And I think this is something that Obi-Wan Kenobi is going to do very well. And that is give something that's going to satisfy the need that some had and the need that some didn't realize they had to have more of Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader. I want to see Darth Vader without the helmet on, portrayed by Hayden Christensen. And I'll point to Rebels, for those that haven't seen, spoiler alert, sorry, but in the confrontation between Ahsoka and Darth Vader, when she finally comes to understand that it is Anakin Skywalker, when her lightsaber smacks his helmet and you see part of his face. There's a connectivity there, even with the animated Anakin Skywalker, that I'm desperate to see on screen with Hayden Christensen portraying that role. George Lucas has commented several times that a lot of people thought that we would get Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader right out of the gate in the prequel movies, and the fact that that didn't happen until the end of Revenge of the Sith was a disappointment for a lot of people. And I think that now we're going to get the full realization of what a lot of people wanted, and that was we're going to get both Darth Vader, but we're going to get that connective tissue, literally, with a very charred Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker being in the Darth Vader suit. All right, moving on, they get into quite a bit of detail about Ahsoka, and I'll get through some of the broader points here. In October of 2021, Rosario Dawson had shot guest spots. She read a trade report about Christensen possibly joining her standalone Ahsoka show. And she went online and posted, "Sky Guy, they know!" ! See you soon, Snips. Only later did she realize that the report was just an unconfirmed rumor that Anakin Skywalker, who had been the character's mentor, would appear in the Ahsoka show. Now, Ahsoka will appear on Disney Plus in 2023 though Lucasfilm, eager to reclaim secrecy, still won't confirm if Rosario Dawson had inadvertently leaked the truth about Anakin or if it was just a false report. Now, the quest Ahsoka has hinted at in her guest appearances on The Mandalorian and Boba Fett, hunting an Imperial Grand Admiral named Thrawn who vanished into deep space, spoiler, at the conclusion of the animated series, Rebels series, is likely to be explored further, although plot details are still being tightly held. Ahsoka is a continuous story Filoni offers. It is definitely driving toward a goal, in my mind, as opposed to being a singular adventure. And that's what I want the character to be doing, and I think that's what fans want now. And what I like about this is that The Mandalorian felt like those singular adventures. It was leading to a broader point. Don't misunderstand. I realize that. But they were sort of video game-esque. Mandalorian needs to accomplish something, but in order to accomplish something, by the end of the episode, he needs to go and complete this task. It sounds like what they're doing with Ahsoka is going to be more of a continuous story. And I really, really hope that they do latch on to that. Because I know as a fan, even with Rebels, I was talking about it with our current producer of the show, Brett, and he'd never watched Rebels, and I was trying to convince him that it really is some of the best storytelling outside of the movies in the original trilogy of all of Star Wars. And he was a little, put off by the animation part of it. I'm like, watch it, get past it, you'll love it. And even when I watch Rebels, there are those sort of throwaway episodes. They do have some connectivity, but in the end of the day, those are more just to kind of really give the kids something more as opposed to the meteor stories. I prefer more of the meteor stories. Now, to keep minting fans, Lucasfilm must give new generations their own collection of characters to love and hate, and not every classic character can be brought back endlessly anyways. Kennedy is well aware of all this now. In The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, Mark Hamill, now 70, delivered performances as 30-something Luke Skywalker, but younger actors played Luke's body while advanced deepfake technology replaced the face. Bringing Luke to life now is a team sport, but that tech has its limitations, so does recasting. Now, here's where the big controversial moments of the article came into play. The 2018 movie Solo explored Han Solo's younger years, with Alden Ehrenreich taking on the role of a smuggler originated by Harrison Ford. The film has its admirers, but it made less at the box office than any other live-action Star Wars movie. Solo's swagger may be too singular for another actor to replicate. There should be moments, Kathleen Kennedy says, along the way when you learn things. Now it does seem so abundantly clear we can't do that. A lot of people have been taking issue with that comment, and especially when she's making, it's kind of attached with this replacing legacy characters with younger actors, right? But of course, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Obi-Wan Kenobi has been portrayed now by Ewan McGregor, more so than Sir Alec Guinness. That being said, Alec Guinness wasn't really in the original trilogy all that much. Obi-Wan Kenobi really owns that character now. We also know that Lando is still on the horizon. That still is allegedly in production, with Donald Glover reprising that role. I think a part of what she's saying here, though, is that they can't continue to go down the road of just recasting other actors or actresses in these legacy characters. And I think specifically, they're not going to go and do a Luke Skywalker series with another total actor. They may get the technology to the point where they do the deep fake type technology like we've seen in the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian to have it look just like Mark Hamill. We may even get something like that about Carrie Fisher, but you're not going to see another actor portraying those characters. And also, it needs to be said, and I haven't heard anybody mention this, Lucasfilm and Disney, they all have access to information that we don't. And they may have data. They may have empirical data showing that casual fans didn't need to see a Solo backstory, didn't want to see another actor portray Harrison Ford as Solo. So I wish that people would keep that in mind, or maybe people don't realize that, but they have access to a lot of information. And like I said before, I won't repeat my entire rant. I really do believe that the biggest stumbling block for Solo was that it wasn't must-see Star Wars. I think Bob Iger, Kathleen Kennedy, and the Brain Trust, they call it, we'll get into this more in a moment, really were under the impression that they could pump out any good Star Wars movie and the fans would go and see it. And it's just not true. We'd been conditioned, and Drew, the co-host that I mentioned in the podcast, the post-show podcast today, made a great point. We've been conditioned by the point of Solo coming out, of going to the theater to see a story that takes place within a certain universe, more specifically the MCU. That story is going to have a lot of connective tissue where you have to see it if you're going to be able to follow the story and the next story that comes, even if it is about a different character. That wasn't the case for Solo. I mean, the closest thing that we got was, we found out why Han and how and why Han met Chewie, and we know at the end of the movie he's going to meet Jabba the Hutt, but those are not necessarily things that were all that crucial for anybody. You could live without that information, where in almost all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, there's information in there that is needed and as a necessity for the next project coming up. To endure, Star Wars will need actors, new characters, a new era, vaulting away from the timeline as we know it. Another upcoming series, The Acolyte, reportedly starring Amandala Stenberg, I always get her name wrong, aims to do just that. The show is in the casting phase, but the writing is largely complete, says showrunner Leslie Headland, co-creator of the time-looping Netflix show Russian Doll. She has been planning for it. For 2 years, mostly in the confines of her home. As we mentioned before, it takes place, The Acolyte, roughly 100 years before The Phantom Menace. A lot of these characters haven't been born yet, and she asks those questions about, well, why did we end up in the place that we ended up in The Phantom Menace? Headland describes The Acolyte as a mystery thriller set in a prosperous and seemingly peaceful era when the galaxy is still sleek and glistening. We actually use the term the Renaissance or the Age of Enlightenment, she says. Jedis were not always ascetic monk-like figures living selflessly and bravely. The Jedi uniforms are gold and white, and it's almost like they would never get dirty. They would never be out and about, Headland says. The idea is that they could have these types of uniforms because that's how little they're getting into skirmishes. So again, this kind of bumps up against what we mentioned before of the end of the High Republic. And as I've admitted, I have not gotten into any of the High Republic yet. None of it has really drawn me in enough from what I've seen. Eventually I will, and now that I've completed, for now, my EMBARK series, perhaps I'll spend some time doing that. And maybe I'll even grab a book and try reading it if the pain medication in the hospital after my open heart surgery allows me to go and do so. Then they go and spend a little bit of time talking about Grammar Rodeo. I won't repeat what I mentioned before, just talking about how this is going to be taking place after the events of Return of the Jedi, and it's a galactic version of the classic Amblin coming-of-age adventure films. So, this leaves the question of what's happening with the Star Wars movies. We have a roadmap, and I'll be getting into a little bit more of this because there was another piece that came out with more specificity that I'll share with you some points from. But, to the broader points. We have a roadmap. Talking about the big screen return is unlikely to follow the same cadence as before. Mentioning Taika Waititi, his film Rogue Squadron by Patty Jenkins being further off, Kevin Feige producing a Star Wars film, Rian Johnson's film that was announced 5 years ago being backburnered. The emphasis on television is already influencing the upcoming film slate. I hesitate to use the word trilogies anymore because Star Wars is much more about persistent storytelling, Kennedy says. Now she just needs to recruit feature filmmakers. Okay, more on this coming up. I also pulled an article from Entertainment Weekly talking about Obi-Wan Kenobi and the possibility of Ahsoka and Boba Fett cameos, to which they're very cagey about this. Without naming any specific characters, the Kenobi director Deborah Chow tells Entertainment Weekly the viewers should expect more cameos and appearances to derive from the films as opposed to characters who've already been introduced in the live-action universe. Given the nature of our characters, the strongest connective tissue for us was the prequels. Because in large part, that's where our characters are coming from, and that's where their stories started. So really, the prequels are sort of the most connected to our series. and again, I keep teasing this, but I'll get to it. This is where the connectivity and the storytelling is really starting to begin to take shape, and why I'm a little bit more confident in the future of Star Wars being televised, even though I want my feature-length films. As for Ahsoka specifically, Kathleen Kennedy makes it sound like the character's upcoming series will follow her later live-action timeline, with her on the hunt for Grand Admiral Thrawn, whom she first encountered on Rebels. And as we know, our understanding based off of Dave Filoni is that when we first see Ahsoka in The Mandalorian Season 2, that is before the final shot of Rebels, for those that are familiar with it. And I do speculate and expect that the encounter that we see with Ahsoka and Luke Skywalker in the Book of Boba Fett will be fleshed out further as to why she is there at that moment in the Book of Boba Fett. We'll find out in the Ahsoka show, because this all ties into what they're doing with the storytelling now. Of course, Rebels also seems to be a big inspiration for Obi-Wan Kenobi, with the Grand Inquisitor, who was first introduced in Season 1 of the animated series, making his live-action debut. Played now by Rupert Friend, the fallen Jedi-turned-Jedi Hunter appears to play a large role in the new series, at least judging from the upcoming trailers. All right, moving on. We also have an article from Vanity Fair explaining why Jon Favreau says that Boba Fett couldn't break bad. And the broad overview on this from the article is that The Mandalorian, as we've all speculated, really was what was supposed to originally be Boba Fett. But they decided to go with The Mandalorian instead. So when they got to the phase of wanting to tell Boba Fett's story, they decided that while Boba Fett was basically bred to be bad, people change, right? The legend of Boba Fett may have simply been overtaken the reality that George Lucas presented on screen. Boba Fett is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I grew up with Boba Fett as a faceless, quiet, mysterious bounty hunter. All we knew was that he was scary enough that Darth Vader saw him as somebody to set out after Han Solo, Favreau says. Now, that's fascinating because Filoni kind of pushes back against that. And what he says is, now he agrees that fans bought into the myth of Boba Fett rather than accept that he was often more clever than he was combative. Boba Fett calls Darth Vader to capture Han Solo. He doesn't capture Han Solo. Filoni notes of Fett's big moment in Empire. He gets on the phone and he says, "Come here and get Solo, I found him." He also disagrees with the popularly held notion that Fett was one of the few characters who could defy Darth Vader. It's funny, when you say he stands up to Darth Vader, does he do that? I think he was hired, and Vader tells him no disintegrations, and he's like, okay, Filoni says. I love Boba Fett, but even when I was a kid, the idea that he fell into the Sarlacc pit actually never disappointed me, because I'm like, that story's not about him. I just thought that was fascinating because it actually pushes back against what Favreau says. And they really did try to model the Book of Boba Fett, and it goes into this in the article, after Don Corleone and the Godfather saga. I went back and I watched the Book of Boba Fett. I enjoyed it more on a rewatch, especially after watching the Gallery documentary about the Book of Boba Fett. After seeing what their expectations were, I will say this, and we have a listener feedback that speaks of this as well. That season finale for the Book of Boba Fett, I'm sorry, in my opinion, was just weak. That was it was young kid level action and storytelling. There's the characters and the battle. I like the Scorpion X. I like the Rancor. That's all cool, but the number of individuals fighting each other is way too small. It all seemed very low budget and downscaled. It just didn't have any sort of epic battle, feel to it at all. And there's a lot of inconsistencies in it too. Chris Stanton, at one point, and I'm kind of ruining this email from a friend of the show, but I'm going to get into it. There's one point he gets injured and he's dragging his injured foot along the ground, but then later on at the end of the episode, he's walking around like he's fine. I just really have a lot of issues with that season finale. All right, so here's the last bit, and we're going to get into the meat of all of this and probably what you care about them. Well, let me rephrase. I don't know if it's what you care about the most. It's what I care about the most, and that is the movies. looking for committed filmmakers that are ready to work for Star Wars for the foreseeable future. This was the continuation of what we got in the original Vanity Fair piece, but getting into more context of what Kathleen Kennedy actually said. So we're going to be treading over a little bit of ground that we already covered, but it's to a larger point. They asked Kathleen Kennedy, can we touch upon the classic storytelling, the movies? I know Taika Waititi's untitled film, Patty Jenkins doing Rogue One. Do you have a roadmap for features? Are you still developing that? And again, she says, we have a roadmap. I would say that Taika's story fits more specifically into that. Rogue Squadron, we kind of pushed off to the side for a moment. Patty is developing a script further. Then we will talk about how that connects to the central spine of what we're working on. There's a couple of filmmakers that we've been in conversation with over quite a long period of time that I'm hoping will come in and make an overall commitment that John and Dave had made. That's ideally what I would love to see happen in the feature space. Okay, so we're beginning to see a little bit of the details of what I'm going to lay out for you here in a moment and why Rogue Squadron was put to the side. Are you talking about a commitment to make, say, 3 movies, or are you talking about an even bigger commitment of shepherding phases of films in the way that Kevin Feige did with Marvel? She says, I wouldn't go so far. Kevin is an anomaly, an amazing one, but the goal is definitely having somebody make more of a commitment. I hesitate to use the word trilogies anymore because Star Wars is much more about persistent storytelling. They still want to do the Ryan trilogy, and Ryan is still connected in the Brain Trust meetings, but he's overscheduled, and he doesn't have time to commit. One of the enduring questions, though, that fans have about Rian Johnson and his future with Star Wars. Is there anything you can tell me about that? I know he said the trilogy is still on, but it's been so many years since it was announced. Is it still the case? Can we resolve what's going on with his idea? Ryan has been unbelievably busy with Knives Out and the deal he made at Netflix for multiple movies. I've had meetings with Ryan. He's somebody that's come in as part of our little brain trust discussions along the way. He remains very committed to what it is we're trying to do. He just literally hasn't had the time to devote. That's what I'm saying. Anyone who comes into Star Wars needs to know that it's a 3, 4, 5-year commitment. That's what it takes. You can't step in for a year and shoot something and then walk away. It doesn't work that way. Also, Lucasfilm are trying to create new eras right now. The Acolyte being the first wave of that. Kennedy also confirms that they've been using the publishing High Republic as a testing ground for a lot of things. I know The Acolyte hasn't started shooting yet, but that's also on the horizon for Lucasfilm. That series is not as tied to the characters we already know, right? She said, it's a bit of an experiment for us because it isn't building within the timeline and the era that John and Dave are in. It isn't necessarily going to be where features are. We're moving into a new era, what showrunner Leslie Headland is doing. There are certainly reflections of things that people are going to recognize, and it will have connectivity in Star Wars. But this will be a whole new era of storytelling if we determine, like we did with The Mandalorian, that it works and that there's interest. I think there will be. Then they ask, how important is it to get outside the gravity of the Star Wars of the Skywalker saga? Moving beyond the characters we know, how vital is it to open up these new realms? I think it's vital, just staying within the construct of George's storytelling, to keep chipping away at it. I think would be wrong. It's our job to step away now, but still have a connection to the mythology that George created. That won't stop. But we are moving on from the Skywalker saga. That's taking a lot of time, discussion, and thought right now. Is publishing the test kitchen for some of the new eras? It is, Kathleen Kennedy said, we're putting into motion about 5 years ago because we don't have the benefit of just pulling a book off the shelf. Now, I do disagree with that, even though I am not a Legends expanded universe type of fan. I do think that there's a lot they could be pulling from the expanded universe. Okay, so what does this all mean? I spent almost 50 minutes giving you all the details of what Vanity Fair had to say. And you may be going, that makes sense to me, or maybe going, I'm lost. What in the hell are they doing? Here's your bit of a preview. I'm going to put on my pontificating hat here. Here's my guess. Here's my best extrapolation of what Kathleen Kennedy is saying and what we're going to hear next week. And I really do think this all goes back to Solo and why Solo failed. We're going to get different timelines. We're going to get different eras. Pre-prequels, post-prequels, post-original trilogy, eventually post-sequels. However, it's all going to have connective tissue. Live action, animation, and movies. They're not going to roll the movies out like they did the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The focus will be on television. The future of Star Wars will be televised. But the films are going to be connected within these timelines to the live action that they're producing. We could have a Taika Waititi film that goes all the way back to tell about the beginning of the Sith and the Jedi that will eventually have connective tissue to what we're getting with High Republic era content via live action, like The Acolyte. We're getting post-prequel material that has connective tissue to the prequels. But I'm also guessing that what we see in Obi-Wan Kenobi is going to have some pretty strong connective tissue to eventually what we're going to get later this year with Andor. Now, Obi-Wan Kenobi is a bit of an outlier. They don't necessarily have to do that because it already has sort of a built-in hype around it. But I'm telling you, this is what their plan is. This is all going to be connected. That's how the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Marvel storytelling has worked so well so far. What if the Marvel series, animated series, I didn't really have much interest in watching. However, there was a part of me going, I better watch this because it might have connective tissue later on. And guess what? It did. Spoiler alert, if you've seen Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, there's going to be moments in that where if you didn't watch What If, it's not going to have nearly as big of an impact. And people that saw What If and watched Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness talk to their friends who didn't watch What If, they're going to be going, you need to go back and watch What If because it's going to give you context for A, B, C, and D in the Doctor Strange movie. This is where they're going. Solo, I think, was a massive knee-jerk reaction, but Solo's lackluster box office performance sent a shockwave through Lucasfilm that will now resonate for decades to come, for good or for bad. I ultimately think it's going to be for good. It just depends on the execution. I'm fearful of what's happening with Marvel because it just feels like it's a mess right now. It really does. And that's my own opinion. I do love the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not nearly as much as I love Star Wars. However, I just there's so much content coming out, and again, I miss Marvel and She-Hulk. I'm like, But again, there's a part of me going, well, but when the movies come out, I'm gonna want to go and see those. And how much of this am I gonna need to watch? But this is where we're heading. It's all gonna have connective tissue, and that's why Rogue Squadron, in my opinion, got shelved. I think Rogue Squadron was more of a singular film on its own that didn't have any connective tissue. And I think what they're saying is, oh, shoot, we really need to have this storytelling all be tied together. We need to go and now retool Rogue Squadron to have it fit into the timeline in a way that you need to go watch Rogue Squadron in the theater if you're going to go watch blank live-action TV show coming in 2024 or 2025. That's where I think we're heading. That's what I think we're going to get next week at Star Wars Celebration. That's what I believe we're going to be told about Taika Waititi's movie when he walks out on stage, which I'm almost guaranteeing is going to happen. Taika Waititi is going to walk out on stage at Star Wars Celebration next week, and they're going to give details on his movie. Now, here's a big one for you, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, all right? I could be completely wrong. I don't care if I am. Here is my hot take. We're still getting a movie in 2023, and it's going to be Taika Waititi's film. I think that there's been that they've been keeping it under wraps. We've had a lot of rumor reports about productions going on that certain spoilerific, leak-heavy outlets like Bespin Bulletin and Making Star Wars have been talking about. We also know that while some projects they've been able to keep a closed lid on, other ones they haven't. I don't know what's happening in Obi-Wan Kenobi. The entire series is out there to be read. I haven't read it. I've actually kept myself spoiler-free. Shock. I know a little bit about the first couple of episodes, but I stopped. And I know out there right now you can read full breakdowns of what Obi-Wan is coming in Obi-Wan Kenobi. You take it or leave it. I believe that Taika Waititi has had Thor: Love and Thunder in the can for a while. He's already had Star Wars written. My take is they've done casting. They've been doing pre-production on it, and it's going to shoot later this year, and we're getting a movie at the end of 2023. It is on the schedule, and it's essentially 2 years out, but I think they are way farther along on that film, and we're getting Taika's film at the end of next year. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but if I'm right, I'm a genius. That wraps up the show this week. Apart from some listener feedback, I did say I was going to get to it, didn't I? And I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's not a lot, but while we have some time, let's go ahead and get to the listener feedback this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, first listener feedback comes from Javier, who writes, "Wish you the best on your surgery and soon recovery." Thank you, Javier. I was disappointed with the Boba Fett scenes of finale. The full TV show was not bad, but the best chapters were by far the ones with Mando and Luke, also the appearance of Cad Bane. But the finale was something awful. I agree, unfortunately. It seemed like I was watching a Class C science fiction movie. And again, he points to Kerr Stanton. Was hurt on his foot, couldn't even walk, and the next scene he's running like hell. I did not like the cyborgs either. Yeah, I tried to. I know these are details, but Star Wars is based on details, and I felt it was disrespectful on the history. Definitely, Robert Rodriguez is not for Star Wars. Javier, I tend to agree. I feel like had Filoni or Jon Favreau with the same material been the ones that were helming that, I feel like it would have been a heck of a lot better. Miranda Alicia writes, I have to say that Kenobi is the most important project of this Disney era of Star Wars, almost more than the sequel trilogy and the Mandalorian series put together. I do not think there has been such a massive amount of word of mouth in the form of speculations, predictions, anticipation. Even keeping up to date with the production from a casting standpoint. People have talked about it for years, even as long as we've seen the first teaser. The excitement drawing from this has been astronomically massive, probably since the days away from The Force Awakens. Yeah, pretty much. There's at least something for everyone to look forward to in this series, from the prequel to the original trilogy to the Disney-era fans as well. I don't think there's been one person, YouTuber, podcaster that hasn't expressed enthusiasm for this. I get the feeling that maybe the reason why, because this will probably be the last time or one of the few last times that we're going to get content from the Skywalker era. Great point. Before we really move forward and beyond, and I think everyone wants to take advantage of that while we can. We can't stay in the same places forever. At some point, you really have to press forward, and we need this franchise to grow. We need to see new places and meet new people. Someday, they'll all be our new favorites. You never know. In the meantime, let's impatiently wait to see our old friend Kenobi again one last time. Peace. Great points, Miranda. Thank you so much. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to SheVP, who wrote a really touching and emotional prayer for me, and I just really appreciate it. I can't really say enough in asking for God's guiding hands to the doctors and nurses who are going to perform this surgery on me coming up on June 15th. I love you, brother. SheVP, I love you too. And it really means a lot to me that you wrote that out. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. And just so everybody knows, I'm in good spirits over this. I'm excited to get this surgery out of the way, as I mentioned on last week's show. And if this is your first time listening, I would encourage you to go back and listen to last week's episode, where I get into great detail about my third upcoming open heart surgery. I know this is happening for a reason, and it's to close the book on this chapter of my life, get myself fixed for this next chapter of my life. And I've got all the confidence in the doctors, the surgeons who are going to be conducting the surgery, and I know that after we're done, after they're done, I'll be in much better shape than I was before I went in, and ready to recover and get back to life as we know it. We got several weeks before then. I'm feeling fine. I had a procedure this week to take a look at my heart overall, and the rest of my heart is functioning great. We just have to get in there and fix that leak in my graft aorta. And they're going to do that coming up in the next few weeks. All right, I'll be back again next week, and I don't know what the plan is next week. You may not get a full podcast. You might get a lot of small podcasts, depending on what news drops. But don't worry, my nerd world and this voice will be here to guide you along the way as we get all of the information and hopefully reveals and my gosh, if they released this much information and background on the future of Star Wars, I can't imagine what we're going to get at the actual convention next week. So before I let you go, as I mentioned at the start of the show, today, this Thursday, May 19th, 2022, is the release of, for now, I haven't decided what the future of EMBARK is going to be. I have another series in mind. If people want more EMBARK stories, I'll write more EMBARK stories. But the final book in the series so far, Battle Planet, Book 7, is now available in hardcover and paperback with the audiobook coming soon. Go and pick out your ebook, hardcover, or paperback preferred copy. And I want to mention as well, the entire ebook series is on sale right now at a discounted price for the next few days. The cheapest that I've ever put all of the ebooks on sale for you to go and pick up. If it's your first time listening to the show and you're wondering, what is the story all about? Book 1 kicks off our science fiction space opera. As Earth faces its end, the fight to rule the stars begins. Taft Guardia picked the right day to upgrade his ship when fellow pilot, and the girl he longs to be with, Keith Amaro, arrived needing help investigating a cryptic message left behind by her late aerospace engineer father. Unaware that an industrial accident inside Earth's largest supplier of civilian and military spacecraft has set off an apocalyptic chain of events, they make a shocking discovery. As war erupts during the global evacuation, Earth's evacuees stand upon the brink of annihilation. Realizing the significance of what they found with the help of a ragtag squadron of pilots, Taft and Keitha might be humanity's greatest hope for survival among the stars. If you like your science fiction space opera epic filled with romance and action, then EMBARK is perfect for you, or for a friend or family member who likes to read and loves sci-fi. Written for adults but courageous for ages 8+, buy EMBARK Book 1 today. It's available at mynerdworld.net or on Amazon.com. Search for EMBARK and Jon, Jon Justice. And look, if you're planning on picking up the new book, do not delay. This window today and tomorrow and Saturday with the majority of people purchasing the book is the best opportunity I have to hit the bestseller list. So do not delay in buying whatever your preferred copy is of any of the stories at this point in time to get caught up or to get the last book in the series. Thank you so much for supporting my nerd world and my attempts to be an author. I guess I am an author, but my continued being an author. And for listening to the show. I really do appreciate it. And again, we'll be back next week with all the coverage you can handle over Star Wars Celebration. Until then, wherever you are, I hope you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. And we'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.